Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Jason Knight, and on each episode of this podcast I'll be having frank and open conversations about building and marketing products and building the businesses behind them. I'll be digging deep into best practices, war stories and hot takes to try and inspire you to build the right things, build them right, and get them to market effectively. If you want more of that in your wallet, why not head over to onenightinproduct.com where you can sign up to the mailing list, subscribe on your favourite podcast app or follow the podcast on your favourite social media platform and guarantee you never miss another episode again. On tonight's episode, we head back down under and talk about product management in New Zealand and cover it all from Indigenous representation in tech, CPOs without product management backgrounds, product owner feature factories and much more. We reflect on sales-led versus product-led organisations, what to do in the face of scepticism, and some of the ways we might turn companies from one to the other. We also reflect on whether New Zealand's really down under at all, or whether it's at the southeastern corner of a flat earth just north of the ice wall. For all this and much more, please join us on One Night in Product. So my guest tonight is Anthony Marter. Anthony's a product and delivery coach and product leadership consultant, occasionally curmudgeonly cyclist and biannual dance contest organiser. Anthony's working hard to bring in good product management practices, product culture and empowered product teams, not only around the world but doubling down in New Zealand as the chair of Product Aotearoa, a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to nurturing, connecting and increasing the impact of product professionals in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Anthony's also a former electrical engineer, so I'm sure he's well-grounded, somewhat neutral, but a real live wire. Hi Anthony, how are you tonight?
Oh dear, that I didn't expect, the electrical engineer pun. Well done, that was fantastic. I'm fantastic here this morning, Jason.
I remember my physics teacher once coming up to me in a plug wiring lesson and saying to me, "Knight, that is the unsafest plug I've ever seen in my life."
Oh dear, all right, never let Jason wire the house then.
Exactly. So, first things first, you're involved in a number of things.
Mm-hmm.
But let's start with a day job. So, you're a consultant. You seem to have been embedded with a fintech or financial services company called Harmony or Harmony for about a year or so now. So, are you consulting alongside that? Or is that sort of your main gig at the moment and you're going to go back to the consulting afterwards?
Yeah, so I kind of do a hybrid sort of role. So, Harmony's I call Harmony the day job, product and delivery coach there, which involves working with their product management team, coaching them, helping them out with practices and processes, and then also working with the engineering team as well, kind of basically being an agile coach for the engineering team, but through a product management lens, which I find is sort of a really interesting kind of angle to take with them. It's sort of a lot more practical, I reckon, my personal opinion. So that actually started out as a consulting engagement, and kind of they decided that, you know what, this is actually a full-time role that's really useful to their business because they really like to invest in their people. So that kind of expanded to 3 to 4 days a week. And then I do sort of other random consulting and the other 1 to 2 days a week. So that's kind of working with startups, basically, actually I was talking to somebody on Friday and I kind of describe it as I want to have the opportunity to help influence companies on how they do product management at the right moment, so that in a year's time, I don't have a product manager in the community come to me and say, "Oh, I'm working for XYZ company and it's terrible." And I think, oh my God, if I just had the opportunity to put my oar in at the right moment, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad environment for them.
So that's interesting, kind of course correcting at the right time rather than when it's too late, which is obviously very agile as well, which is obviously what you'd expect from an agile coach. But with Harmony then, is that quite a big company or is it still fairly small and agile itself?
We're small by world standards, middle-sized, I think, by New Zealand standards. So about 70-odd staff, 5 engineering teams. Basically, they're a very technology-focused company. So a lot of financial services companies, because we do personal loans, that's our product. A lot of people do that with humans. We want to do it with machines. And so engineering is actually the largest part of the organization and why it's their kind of biggest investment. And we, real live machine learning in production, unlike a lot of companies who just talk about machine learning. We actually have some really cool algorithms actually in production, which is, it's a cool place to work. They're on a very interesting kind of trajectory.
But the delivery manager tends to suppose maybe a slightly complicated delivery mechanism in the sense that you have to have someone there to actually kind of make sure all the pieces come together. Is it that kind of delivery manager or is it a little bit simpler than that?
I would describe the role as kind of team wrangler. So as I said, this is a temporary thing. I'm just doing it for a couple of months while I cover for somebody who resigned a little while ago, and we have a new hire just locked in last week, so they'll be here in a couple of weeks' time, so I can pull back from that and go back to being a coach again, or full-time coach. I'm just doing it part-time right now for them. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty common in New Zealand to have a delivery manager. The role is actually officially called product owner because reasons. And that's a long story. We can get into the whole product manager, product owner thing later.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's basically it's sort of wrangling the team, getting everybody working and sort of moving in the same direction, helping manage dependencies, working with, we have one of these roles per Scrum team. And so it's working with the other teams in anything that's a dependency. And also, with my kind of coaching hat on, it's actually an excuse to get really hands-on with the team and kind of learn their foibles and whatnot, which is going to help out the coaching stuff that I'll revert back into later on.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But when it comes down to the consulting, which you're still doing alongside that, maybe a little bit less than you were before, because obviously you've got this taking up a lot of your time. You've touched on really wanting to sort of get in early and course correct. Make sure you're setting product managers up for success, which again, we could talk about in a bit. But does that mean that you explicitly don't work with, for example, really big enterprises or big professional service firms or that type of company? Or do you kind of work for anyone who comes along and try and do your best to try and transform the best way you can?
Well, I hate to say the latter because that makes it sound like, I'll just do anything, but...
Gun for hire, right?
Yeah, but I mean, as I said, it's about trying to have influence on the organization, and a lot of it is because of, I'm trying to do the best by the community down here and actually set the community up for success. So it's less about earning the money, that kind of helps, but it's more about trying to actually set companies up for success. It's kind of interesting in New Zealand, and something we can get onto it a bit later around the maturity of product management down here. But it has been identified by us in the community and also by some of the government organisations down here that it's one of the things that's kind of holding New Zealand industry back a little bit. That we have a lot of really great ideas. There's a lot of amazing innovation that comes out of New Zealand, a lot of really innovative stuff. But the commercialization aspect, the product market fit, the actual, and then once a company we have a bit of a long history of companies that have like a smash hit and then they kind of go through this arc and kind of die because they're not evolving, they're not moving with the market. And so that's a bit where I look at that and go, you know what, if I can have an influence on that, I'm setting the community up for success. I'm setting sort of New Zealand Inc. up for success as well.
Well, let's talk about your efforts in the community then. So I know you're the chair at Product Aotearoa, which is a not-for-profit aimed at promoting product practices in New Zealand. So I guess the first question is, how did you get involved in that, aside from just your passion? I mean, how did you specifically get involved in that? And what are some of the initiatives that organisation is currently promoting in New Zealand?
Yeah, so word on the name. So Aotearoa is the Māori, so Māori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. So Aotearoa is the Māori name for New Zealand, so that's where that comes from. And we wanted to reflect the indigenous people of the country in our name. So kind of how that came about. So I got involved in what became Product Tank Auckland 5-6 years ago. Seems like a long time now. Yeah, usual story. Got dragged into doing a talk and then sort of helped them out as a volunteer for a little while, and then eventually kind of ended up leading it, where the guy who was leading it previous to me and who'd formed Product Tank, or was known as Product Management Auckland back then. Ironically, he was moving into consulting and decided his consulting gig was getting too busy. So he kind of went, Anthony, here, catch. Shit. What do I do with this thing? And so we kind of grew that. Auckland's always been very active in the product scene. We've kind of been quite noisy, and noisy internationally as well, because we wanted to, we're down here in the corner of the world. So, we wanted to make sure that if we get some really good speakers, some really good knowledge coming to New Zealand, we wanted to make sure we could grab onto it. So we've been quite noisy globally, and that sort of led to us joining forces with Product Tank Wellington, and there's another product management group in Christchurch. So it's the 3 major cities in New Zealand. And so we sort of collaborated on and off with them. The product management and marketing meetup group, they're not a Product Tank, down in Christchurch, was set up by somebody I used to work with. Inevitably in New Zealand, everybody knows everybody. There's like 1 degree of separation in this country. It's crazy. So we're all linked. We've all worked for the same organizations. And so we spent a lot of time collaborating, and then kind of thought, well, maybe we should do more about that. We ran an unconference about a year or so ago now, and actually the Product Aotearoa had its genesis in a very practical problem, which was, we run a conference, we need to handle money. we need to set up an organization for that. And then we thought, well, actually, we've had all this collaboration across the country. We were kind of naturally working together anyway. Let's set up an organization that kind of reflects what we're doing in our meetups, but at a New Zealand kind of scale. So we've very deliberately set it up to be New Zealand wide. We're not aiming it to be a global organization. We kind of feel like there's enough of those at the moment with the Māori products and the other organizations around there. We very much want to be, we don't want to spend our time competing with any other organization. We want to connect and collaborate and add to the global organization of keeping people and product together and doing amazing things.
But you touched on it as well. You're kind of down in the southeast corner of the flat Earth, right? So
about to fall off the edge.
Yeah, just near the ice wall.
Yeah.
So time zone wise, we're at a bit of a disadvantage, especially when it comes to getting some of these top speakers. I mean, has that been an issue for you, or have you always managed to kind of work out something and find something that works for everyone?
It's kind of funny. We actually end up crossing over with most time zones. UK and Europe's a little bit of a problem, but the US and Asia, we cross over with the US in the morning. We cross over with Asia in the afternoon and evening. And so time zones have been less of an issue. And a lot of us work for global organizations, like, for the last 10 years, or even before that, I've been working for organizations that are in different time zones. So we're just kind of like, meh, we're used to it. But where we actually started with was more about actually just making sure that we could grab speakers when they came to New Zealand, because most people, if they come to New Zealand, they come here once and that's it. We're so blooming far away from everywhere, 26 hours minimum from Europe and the UK by plane. So, we wanted to make sure that we'd be able to grab them when they were here. And so that was kind of the genesis of being noisy. But lately what we've found, except for when I cock up time zones because of daylight savings, morning talks work quite well for us. So it allows us to kind of vary the time that we have talks for our audience. If we want to do a morning talk, we can get someone sort of on the US East Coast or even Pacific, and the UK and Europe as well, if people don't mind being up late in their evenings, like you are now. Thank you for that.
No worries.
And then, if we do something in the evening, that enables us to bring in a speaker from Asia or Australia.
Yep.
So the time zones kind of work well. As I said, it's more about actually just people knowing that we exist. That's kind of been our main challenge.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And I think that it's like you say, as long as you're being noisy and you kind of keep on banging that drum, then you're probably doing quite a good job there. But I wanted to touch on it before I forget to touch on it, and that's because it's a really important subject. And you mentioned yourself before, like the idea of kind of getting more Indigenous people, for example, into the product community. So I'm assuming that means there's kind of a lack of numbers at the moment, like not that many Maori people in the product community. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Māori and Pasifika, so Pasifika people from the Pacific, Samoan, Tonga and Cook Island, are hugely underrepresented in technology generally here in New Zealand. It is a real significant problem. We're quite lucky and through the various axes of diversity here, male, female, we're quite balanced, and I'm actually quite proud of that. Our meetups are attended often by up to 50%, so 50-50 male-female mix, which I'm actually really happy with.
Yeah.
And that's been, with things like having morning meetups to suit people who are working parents and things like that have really helped with that. Ethnic diversity, I'm as a Pākehā or European New Zealander, I'm used to being the minority in any engineering team that I work in. It is actually very diverse down here because we're a very, very migrant-based community. So a lot of Indian, Southeast Asian people. But yeah, Māori and Pasifika make up sort of, I think, 5 to 10% or 15% of the country down here, and that percentage is not reflected in our community at all. I think I know one person of Māori heritage who's a product manager, two Pasifika people who are in product, and that's kind of it. And it is a real issue. And what we've found is that it's a role model problem. People from those communities just don't view technology generally as a career path. And that's kind of really interesting for product and UX as well, actually, is that, product and UX are very creative disciplines, but people in those communities, the Pacific community in particular is a very creative community. They're very known for their performance art and things like that here. But people think that technology is all about pounding away on a keyboard. And so they go, yeah, that's not for me. And so that's actually one of the things I've been trying to personally do, just generally, is sort of going out into the community, particularly to younger people, and sort of saying, hey, technology is more than just people pounding away on keyboards doing math stuff. there is actually some real creative, artistic aspects to it. And that to me, I think getting that message more out into those communities is going to start to help. And then just, we're starting to see an emerging Pasifika tech scene down here. I'm working with a startup at the moment, helping them out with product they're entirely, apart from me, they're in all Pasifika. And they've sort of brought together a network of people who from the Pacific, and they're trying to put a health tech product to help their community, basically. And so it's, how can we use that as a pathway? People see this and then realize it's done by people like them, except for me. And that, start to generate that wave of, hey, this is actually something that I can get into.
So do you think the tide is slowly but surely turning, or do you think there's still quite significant effort to undertake before you get anywhere near?
I think a bit of both. Like it is definitely turning. These organizations, as I said, like the one that I'm working with now, are starting to emerge. Yeah. But the tide's way out there right now. Like it's got a long way that it can come in.
Right. So there's a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. And fingers crossed that efforts like yours, and I'm sure other people are also putting efforts in. Hopefully, some of these will start to get a bit more interest in certain communities and start to beef up their representation a little bit. So yeah, fingers crossed for that one. So we touched on it earlier before, but how is the product scene in general in New Zealand? Like you touched on it a little bit around how maybe it's slightly lagging behind some of the thought leadership, some of the classic Silicon Valley and other tech hub places. But is it really that far behind, or do you feel that with organizations such as yours, for example, it's really kind of coming up? Do you think that sort of thinking is really bedding in now?
It's a real mix, I would say. The product community here is pretty mature by world standards. Talking with people who are working overseas, all of the problems that we encounter down here in New Zealand are the same problems that everybody encounters globally. Obviously, our talent pool just isn't as broad as other countries, and that's just purely a numbers thing. Small country, 5 million people, so proportionately, it's a small community, and that means that it's hard to find new talent. It was actually why I ended up getting involved in meetups in the first place. I was trying to hire at the time, and it's like, well, these people don't exist. We're going to have to get out there and create them. So the community is a very energetic community where I think per capita, Auckland and Wellington in particular, we're actually one of the biggest product meetups globally, on a per capita kind of basis. So we have a lot of enthusiasm, engagement in the community here. So a lot of energy, a lot of passion. Where we're struggling is kind of in two areas. So first area is leadership. Chief product officers are pretty thin on the ground here. Leadership at the exec table is very thin on the ground in New Zealand. That role has really only started to come up even in the past couple of years. And one of the things we're noticing, and one of our Product Aotearoa team has been doing a bunch of research into this, is that a lot of people who have the title Chief Product Officer in particular have not started as a product manager. They've been They've been an exec coming from, interesting. Maybe it's something that's a problem globally. I don't know. We were still doing our research on this. So we can talk more.
Yeah, I don't think it's unknown. And again, I don't know if this is something that's replicated everywhere, but certainly in the UK and in Europe, I'm well aware of many examples of CPOs or CPTOs, even they're just from different parts of the business, or they're either a very technical person kind of just looking at the product as well, or they're a quote-unquote industry expert that's just sitting there and kind of using their industry knowledge and expertise. Yeah. And that's fine, but it's not 100% fine. I mean, it really depends on the person and like how much they're going to be open to some of the product management thinking and how much of a product thinker they are. And you always worry that the people that are working for these people, like the product managers that are working for these people, aren't necessarily having the best time, having to justify decisions to them in terms that they don't necessarily understand because they've never done the job before. So it's definitely an interesting one, and I think it can work, but it really depends on the person.
Yeah. So down here, there's absolutely a problem. That probably the head of product cohort tends to be more people that have come from a product manager, but they tend to more be people who don't necessarily have a seat at the executive table, and that brings with it a whole set of challenges as well. So that sort of top level leadership having knowledge of what product management really means is problematic, and that then leads into a problem in the community is that, people are being ultimately, their ultimate leadership in their organization doesn't really quite understand what it is they do. It doesn't understand what good looks like. And in a, relatively small community where we're relatively distant from people who can sort of go, that's what good looks like. That's kind of problematic. So that's one of our key challenges. And the second challenge, and this is, these things are kind of related, is the product owner role / cohort down here. And thank you, banks. A lot of that has come from the banks here in New Zealand. They tend to be the larger employees of people who are being product owners, who are really just delivery managers. They are just really just working on the backlog for their particular team. They don't have a say in strategy. They don't have a say in the outcomes that they're trying to get. They're project managers / delivery managers by another name kind of thing. And so people are told, do this role, but they don't get a say in their organization. And that's one thing in particular I'm pretty passionate about, trying to do stuff about and actually get those people to get that cohort to realize, hey, there's more to your world than just doing what the Scrum Guide says. and then there's a connection to, and that's a connection to leadership thing, because in fairness to our leadership cohort, they don't know better. They don't know what good could possibly look like. So it's not people being, this is not happening deliberately. This is happening because we just don't, we have some examples of what good looks like, but we don't have enough.
But then as a consultant, you're going into some of these companies and presumably trying to fix that. But it doesn't sound like an easy thing to fix, especially if, as you say, they don't really have an idea about what good looks like, and there aren't really any examples that you can show them that particularly resonate with them. And they're never going to necessarily trust what good looks like. So how do you as a consultant go in and try and tackle that as a problem?
Yeah, with difficulty. Is the short answer to that. I mean, as part of one of the reasons why I ended up getting into consulting in the first place was actually a bit of a frustration of trying to create that change internally. I worked in a couple of roles where I was trying to be that change agent from internal, and you get frustrated. You're trying to do the day job, you're trying to change the organization. It's you're bashing your head against the wall sometimes, and so it was like, well, actually, I'd rather be invited in to try and make that change, which is a slightly better situation because the organization has admitted that they have a problem, and so you sort of started from that base. But even then, as you say, it's still a challenge, and so. The way I frame it is not so much like, hey, you need to do good product management. It's like, well, why? What do you why could this be important to your organization? And the one thing I come back to is longevity. I mentioned it before. We have a bit of a history of organizations here that they've had a great, they've hit product market fit once. They've got an amazing product out there, even an amazing set of products. And they kind of, gradually go through this arc of that product drifts off. The market fit kind of changes, the market moves, the product moves, technology moves, whatever. Competitors come into the space, and they're not doing good discovery-led sort of product management, which means that they don't see it. And, hubris sets in, and eventually they kind of crash. There's a historic example here that I usually cite of a company called Navman, who they were big in GPS units. Way back in the day when an independent GPS thing was what you had in your car, and they were super expensive and whatnot. Great product, world leading at the time. They were very much right place at right time. They built an amazing, very large organization by New Zealand standards. They really built an engineering cohort. Actually, there's a lot of people who've worked for or worked with that organization over the years down here. But they kind of didn't keep moving with the market. They got bought out by an American company, very large, very process oriented. Classic project management type approaches, didn't move with the market, and eventually they died because they drifted off product market fit. They never kept up, they never reinvented themselves. And to me, that's the example of, if you've got good product management in the organization, they should be the ones who are always kind of looking to challenge and reinvent the organization to keep moving with the market and make it for a really, really sustainable, really good long-term organization. And stop this, I don't know why people view it as inevitable that organizations go like startup to scale up to enterprise to death. Why is that inevitable? How can we make that not inevitable?
Yeah, well, it's the old innovators dilemma, right? Like everyone always talks about Kodak or Blockbuster in these conversations as well. But I think it's really interesting that you've got a local version of that you can tell, which surely must resonate to a large extent with many of the CEOs and exec teams that you talk to, right?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is it does and it doesn't. Like sometimes they go, as I said, sometimes it's just like, well, enterprises just go through that arc. That's just normal. We just try and sustain it as long as possible kind of thing. And of course you have to realize that, founders and funders can have different incentives to perhaps what, people on the ground and product can have. And that's something product people need to be more aware of actually as a bit of a side note. So that's one part of it. And another part of it is like, well, we're different. We're not like that. We're amazing. And so there's a bit of hubris that comes from that. And so the way that I often get around that, particularly if a company's got a bit of scale, is look at how your organization gets stuff done right now. And I will put money on the fact that organizations don't get, that I'm talking to like that. They're not getting stuff done through their org chart, right? There's the people who in the organization who are the ones who really understand how to get outcomes for the customers. And maybe they have the title product manager or maybe they don't. And then it's saying, well, look at how that works. How do you really get stuff done for your customers? It's because, this organization, this group and this silo all get together and have a bit of conversation about what the right thing is for the customer, ignoring what the org chart says, and then they get some stuff done. And maybe that's how you should work.
Yeah.
And by the way, maybe that's called a value stream. And, and it's suddenly getting people thinking, how do you really get outcomes for your customer? Like, how do you really get the stuff done that matters? And starting to shift the orientation of the company towards that.
Yeah. So you've touched on that, which is one way you might want to get in. But what are some other things that are kind of on your bucket list of things that a company should do to become better at making products? Discovery,
in a word. So I was having this conversation with an exec a little while ago, and this is with Harmony, their chief product officer. Again, a great example of someone who hasn't come from a product background, but he really gets it. He's a great guy to work with, and he was saying to me, like, I've got this amazing idea, I think I really don't want to. And we were, and good on him, because he was having this conversation with me. He was not just kind of landing it on his team. And he's like, I really think we should do this thing, but I don't want to be the hippo. I don't want to be going in there and saying, we should, this is the solution. I said, well, okay, have a conversation to help the team to understand how you got to that. Like, how did you go from problems that you saw through your eyes and you heard through your ears and solution that formed inside your mind, like the bit that goes from one to the other. If you can teach your team how to do that, then you'll be able to trust that they will come up with more of these kind of solutions. And to, teach them that, but teach them that short little loop or even a long little loop that, from eyes to brain to mouth kind of thing. That's the bit that they need to get into. And that's the bit that you need to let them kind of grow into. And so it's getting particularly leaders in the company to really shift out into that kind of problem space and go, right, I want you out there identifying the most amazing problems in the world and bringing your team into those problems, and then let them figure out the solutions. Don't just go in and say we should do one of those, because you're doing, if it's just your brain that's doing the problem solution conversion, you're wasting 90%, 95, 99% of the talent in your organization. And by the way, if we do that really well, we'll call it discovery.
Yeah, I guess try not to call it anything for as long as you can, so people don't think that you're just reading buzzwords at them. But obviously that example you just gave was a really good one, and hopefully the CPO took that on board and went and did it. But there are going to be a bunch of these hippos and people that don't necessarily trust in discovery or just think that they've got the right idea already. Also people who maybe just sort of sit down and think, hey, that sounds like that's going to take a long time. And they kind of just want to keep churning stuff out because that's how they think that companies should operate. So have there been any situations in your career where you've gone out to one of these people, you've given them a speech very similar to what you just gave in that example, and they've just said, look, no, there's no way we're going to do that. And if that has happened, have you ever managed to win them round in the end?
So I talk about the concept of war stories. And so sometimes that conversation starts with, yeah, but do you remember when? And every organization has them. Every organization has that complete facepalm of something that everybody thought this was the most amazing thing ever, and they shipped it and it failed. Why? And it's something I do, again, it's kind of a New Zealand thing. We're so light on talent down here that just the idea of wasting any of it just grinds my gears and hopefully grinds other people's gears. And so it's saying, well, let's actually stop wasting our time on, you remember when we built that thing and it just completely failed? Maybe we might want to do a little bit more background on this first to try and bring people around. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Obviously you have to be careful with it because sometimes you're touching on sensitive parts of the organization. I mean, one of the big things there is to try and help them understand why it failed. It's not like, it's like, oh, it was a bad idea. And that sounds really, really impactful to people. It's, and that bad idea was owned by somebody and so therefore they're bad.
Yeah.
And it's actually saying, well, you know what, actually there's some techniques out there which would have helped us have not necessarily said that person was bad for coming up with it, but maybe there are other ways that we could have come at that problem. There were other solutions out there that we could have considered. and saying, well, hey, there's a structure to kind of avoid this, and getting people to understand that kind of cause and effect, that, there's all these great structures and practices and processes that the product community have developed and how they could help with these problems, as opposed to, everybody needs to come up with perfect ideas all the time kind of thing, which is how people who are sort of new or naive in their approach to product tend to be. It's like, I'm going to have the most amazing idea possible, and it's going to be awesome because I'm awesome.
Yeah, and every single hit's got to be a home run, right? Yeah.
And getting organizations to actually be comfortable that that's not the case. Like, actually, if we, the statistic I usually cite, and it's a Google one, and I must figure out where the heck this came from, is that somewhere between 50 to 90% of all ideas that you put through an organization turn out to not have the impact that you expected.
Yeah.
And so that means if you're not knocking out that 90% or 50% or whatever it is at the early stage, you're probably wasting that proportion of your development organization.
And is there a big sales-led culture over there still, like there is in certain parts of Europe, or is it is it getting a bit more towards kind of product-led, everything going through some kind of process and not just sitting there doing whatever the sales team come up with?
I'd like to say no, but yes. So interesting characteristic of the market down here, we're quite dominated by B2B, actually.
Right.
Where there's not that much in the way of B2C happening in New Zealand, although as we get sort of consumer product or consumer companies that are not traditionally product oriented. Like, I did some work with a large grocery retailer a little while ago, and that was kind of an interesting exercise. There's that kind of B2C stuff spinning up, where companies are really, realizing the place that technology plays in their non-technology products. But yeah, other than that, software product organizations were very much dominated by B2B down here. Everything from sort of like the Xeros of the world, who everybody knows, they're obviously B2 SMB, through to, we have a very, very large health tech company down here who are dealing with governments and large enterprises. So that is actually really common. And that tweet that I sent you the other day about Rich Mironov and his duck horse, I still have the picture of the duck horse from when Rich was down here in New Zealand doing a talk. I can visualize that slide in my mind. And he was describing the organization I was working for at the time to a T, that, there's companies trying to take the candy of, big, large customer. And then for that particular organization, we had about 20 customers. So very, very large, sort of $1 million kind of contracts. And when one of 20 who's paying you $1 million or $7 million a year says, I want one of those, it's really, really, really hard to say no.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a scale problem for New Zealand. And the company that I was last head of product for, we had one extremely large customer, and they were 95% of our revenue. And that's a very, very, very tough situation to be in as a product manager. Yeah, that was kind of interesting. So, yes, there's a lot of that going on. And in that situation, it's not so much the sales led is bad. It's like, it's just tough. I feel for the executives in that situation. And, the company I was referring to with the 20 odd customers, they had gone through an IPO, and a lot of the IPO was actually about trying to fund product led development, because they recognized that just doing that sales led development was unsustainable. So I'd say that most of these companies recognize the financial model of product versus services, and recognize that, particularly in New Zealand, where we don't have an infinitely scalable workforce, which is where that services, that sales led kind of, it's the only way it succeeds. It's tough to make that transition. It really is. And we do have a number of companies that are going through that. There was just a discussion that was kicking off in the community the other day where, other people having exactly that same thing. And it was even earlier on in the stage, it was actually, how do we productize our services? How do we make our services more easy, basically a bit more repeatable, so that we can start to move to a more product-led mindset in our organization? There's some companies that have done it well. I used to work for Fiserv. They bought out a New Zealand startup called MCOM. MCOM very much had built some quite bespoke products for a number of customers, or bespoke implementations for a number of customers, and they managed to move to a product mindset basically through the sheer bloody mindedness of the guy who ended up being VP of product. I think he had a tough time. They're one example that had done it successfully, and I was the product manager for their SaaS platform. That was kind of one of the outcomes of that, where they'd really found the common factors, doubled down on them, and had quite a very profitable business as a result. And that was a good example to them of like, well, actually, here's the advantage of the standardization. It can be actually wildly profitable. So usually, long story short, usually what I do when I'm talking with companies about that is I just show them the financial model. I sort of show, well, okay, services revenue or sales-led revenue, where we just kind of build what the customer asks us to. Here's our revenue, here's our cost and our revenue lines they both go up together. Hopefully they're separate from each other, and that's our margin. Sometimes if you get it wrong, the cost line goes over the revenue line and badness ensues. If you're doing product, you've got that hockey stick going on. And so, you might start up with some upfront investment, but hopefully you're going to hockey stick over time. Your cost line will go up as you scale, but your revenue should go up significantly faster. And that kind of gets executives going, oh, okay, now I understand why this is advantageous. And every time I go to that sales-led model, I'm ratcheting up my cost line, and I'm potentially hitting my margins.
Yeah, I guess it's all about trying to land it in terms that they understand as well, with regards to the money, basically.
Mm.
But talking about hockey sticks, who's your prediction for the next big unicorn to come out of New Zealand?
Ooh, good question. That is a tough question, actually. There's a lot of really interesting things happening here in legal tech, actually. And partly I have a little bit of a bias towards that space because my wife's a lawyer.
Oh, there you go.
I look at a lot of the stuff that she does.
Objection.
Yeah. I look at a lot of the stuff that her and her firm does and go, there's so much stuff that can be just commoditized there.
Yeah,
absolutely. And so
yeah.
I think, there's a burgeoning sort of legal tech scene. But it's interesting, actually. We seem to have, like in New Zealand, it's relatively uncommon for companies to compete with each other. Because it's so small, we're all doing kind of different things. But there's about 3 or 4 companies in the legal tech space down here. Previously, we've had a couple of virtual human companies, and there were actually 2 in that space. Yeah, if you'd asked me this question a year or 2 ago, I might have said the virtual human space. That one's kind of gone interesting. But yeah, definitely, I think legal tech. There's some real cool stuff happening here.
Well, we'll keep our eyes open and invest at the right time. And where can people catch up with you after this if they want to chat more about any of the burgeoning tech scene and tech and product scene in New Zealand, or maybe commiserate over some war stories? Yeah,
no, definitely no shortage of war stories in that area. No shortage at all. So LinkedIn or Twitter is usually the best way to get a hold of me. There is literally only one Anthony Marter in the entirety of New Zealand. So if you search for me, I'm pretty easy to find. Sometimes, unfortunately, easy to find. And then also, if you're part of the Mind the Product Slack community as well, I'm on part of that too. So trying to keep an eye on what's happening out there internationally.
All right. Well, I'll make sure to link that in the show notes, and hopefully won't get too many late night or early morning calls.
Oh, I'm sure I will anyway.
So that's been a fantastic chat. So obviously really appreciate you spending your time and taking me through some of your war stories and some advice for anyone listening here to maybe try and avoid some of those wars themselves. Obviously we'll stay in touch, but yeah, as for now, thanks for taking the time.
All right. Thanks very much, Jason. Really enjoyed it.
As always, thanks for listening. I hope you found the episode inspiring and insightful. If you did, again, I can only encourage you to pop over to onenightinproduct.com, check out some of my other fantastic guests, sign up to the mailing list or subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and make sure you share it with your friends so you and they can never miss another episode again. I'll be back soon with another inspiring guest, but as for now, thanks and good night.